Hello, and welcome to Rory's Brainworks, where we get creative and see if it works. Today, I will be reading another chapter 2, from my book. It has been both a thrilling and an exciting time to see the wonderful comments you guys have been leaving me. Your suggestions and critiques fill my heart with joy. As much as she dare not admit it, Marie has been enjoying them as well. She's heard the book in its entirety and is excited to listen to it again. Yes, you are. Don't you lie. Without further ado, let us just hop right into it with the Warsinger Opus, A Breaking of Bells, by Rory Thomassen. Chapter 2, The Dive, The Drag. The prow of the Princess Blade cut through the high, swelling waves of the morning tide. Water from the Diamond Bay fought the rise of the Crimson Sea, causing a choppy wall of warring waves. Shun was shaken out of his stare as the hull of the ship slapped against the water. Men aboard held on to rigging ropes and thick wooden railings as the ship dipped, lurched, and rose again. Shun kept a still, unmoving stance abreast the mainmast, arms crossed and not the least bit fazed by the rocking ship. Shun's natural balance compensated for the movement as the man began to pace around morosely. He was trying to ignore the unnerving looks of the other sailors, ignore the judgmental and weary stares. For all his attempts to stray from looking like he was sticking out, Shun failed marvelously. The despondent man went from staring at the worn planks of the ship to scanning the distant line of the blue sea, and back again as he walked. Shun listened to the waves, the idle chatter of men, anything but the sweet sunken psalm out in the distant horizon calling to him. A song only he could hear, the requiem he had left behind. Crimson Sea waters calmed as they passed beyond the reach of the Diamond Bay's influence. Shirtless men in tight, high-waisted trousers began working on the ropes and shouting to each other. A large, barrel-chested man hollered commands to the sailors, frantic in motion. They knew what they were doing, but he shouted the orders all the same, insulting their worth and threatening to dock pay if he saw anyone slacking in duty. The men heaved sweat-slick arms on rigging ropes to fully furrow the main foresail. Nimble men climbed up the mainmast and unfurled sandy-colored cloth and worked knots into jutting hooks. Sailors below grabbed at the sail and fastened it to pivot points. Shun watched the drama play out as he walked to the aft of the ship. 6 weeks Shun had been working on this vessel. 6 weeks, and most of the crew still found time out of their hurried scramble for awkward, prolonged glances at him. There was no shred of trust for an alien in a foreign land. It was a quick lesson learned. Their side stares and hushed words were expected. They followed Shun wherever he traveled. Even on this Palayan ship where Shun thought his tan skin would fit in with the southern sailors, but that proved wrong. He still stood out of place. Maybe it was because Shun was hairless aside from his thin eyebrows on his flat face, or maybe it was because of the red eyes beneath. No, Shun knew it was definitely that. Irises, like a ring of crimson spray, were seen as an ill omen to the people of Tel. A prominent reason Shun made a habit of keeping his gaze low to the ground. That way he didn't notice their stares. That way he didn't see their fear, their unwelcoming nervousness. Shun only saw their quickened steps away from him. The foreign man walked under the quarterdeck and into the aft galley to begin his work. Baiting cage traps wasn't a glamorous job, but it did offer small joys of honest labor. Menial tasks made it so Shun didn't have to think too hard. He could busy himself and for a brief time forget his loneliness, self-imposed as it was. When his hands were occupied, then his mind could find silence, at least a relative silence. "Gods above and below, these damnable eels!" the hoarse, craggy voice of the man that shared in Shun's job said. "Too slick to cut proper and too pungent to eat. Captain would catch better if he used proper bait and not this slimy sea snake." Shun wasn't sure of the man's name, only because the sailor had never introduced himself. For the most part, like everyone else, He never acknowledged Shun either. The man worked slowly and complained as much as humanly possible. There were times when Shun was so deep in the minutiae of the job that he could also tune out the sailor, but that depended on the Palayan man's mood. Some days were worse than others. Usually near the end of 2 daggers at sea, when they were a blade of days from sailing back to Belrose, did the man really start to pick up in intensity with his grumblings. "I eat my meals with the smell of this stink on my hands," the sailor continued, "and I have to work with this freak that doesn't speak." A chuckle rasped low and ugly out the man's throat. I rhymed. Shun had never met another Palayan quite so rotund as this one, nor had he ever met one quite so pale. Palayans prided themselves on their tan complexions and lithe, agile bodies. It was said that their wit matched the speed of their movements, but this sailor seemed to be the dire opposite of his fellows. Probably why he was stuck in the back of the ship gutting fish and hanging them in the baited pits of cages. Wordlessly, Shun sat on the small stool in front of the blood-painted box used for cutting the eels. A few feet away, the fat, bemoaning sailor looked up with his eyes and then quickly dropped them down to the mucus-covered eel in his hand. "Eyes of a murderer, that one," the fat Palayan mumbled. He looked up to see if Shun was staring back, checked to see if he had heard or if Shun even understood the words. "Never talks, him. Probably doesn't even speak the Tello tongue." Shun did, but that didn't matter. He would have nothing to talk about, nothing to say. No reason for it. Speaking could only create a bond, and he wanted nothing of the sort, especially not with this sad excuse for a Palayan. So Shun picked up his knife and reached into the bucket of dark green eels and grasped at its viscous, scaled body in lieu of responding. The eels were abundant near the sea bottom where the cages rested, trapping all manner of water-faring life that greedily sought the bait inside. Now, the marine life didn't have a keen taste for the eel, but no fish or crab could resist a free meal. "Spent 20 long years in the service of the Belrose Army, and for what?" The sailor belly-ached out of boredom. "Piss-poor pay for guarding empty roads in the Titan Peaks. Ain't no wars to speak of now." A full eel made a loud popping noise and spilled its contents on the shirtless chest of Shun's co-worker. Viscera and gray, oozy discharge from the eel's body ran slowly down his chest and over his fat belly. The Palayan sailor breathed noisily through his flared nostrils and scrunched his lips together in a tight, upset circle. "And for what?" he continued to complain as he returned to his duties, not the least bit bothered to wipe himself off. "Shattered dreams of glory, working on a ship run by imbeciles, with a deaf and mute moron. I dreamed of that glory in battle, fighting next to Eilon and Fog in some great campaign, but I was 30 years too late for that, wasn't I? Now look at me, covered in eel guts. I should have listened to my mother." Shun's hand slipped on the eel he had just opened up, and the hook in his other hand waiting for the fish found only his finger. The digit was punctured at the tip, hook sliding through the flesh and nail. A spark of white-hot pain shot up the foreign man's arm, and he instinctually shook the injured hand in response. The whole of Shun's upended fingernail flew off across the room, barely dodging his fellow worker, still muttering inconveniences to himself. Shun held up his hand and assessed the damage. One hook clean through the tip of his finger. He didn't like what was going to come next, but such was his life. Shun grabbed at the hook with his other hand and started to weave the tool back through the other side. It wasn't a terrible process until he reached the barb near the point of the hook. The pain as the jagged edge started to dig down into his body made the man lose grip and stop pulling. Shun grimaced. Going through was one way, coming back was entirely different. Although Shun supposed he could go the other way, but then he would have to thread the eye of the hook out the finger. So which was it going to be, jagged barb or bulbous round head? Both had a sickening promise to them, and Shun was hoping for a third option. The foreign man sighed. If only there was an easy escape from something like this, then maybe Shun wouldn't wish for death every day. A sad song near to the horizon briefly found its way past the waves and wooden planks to reach Shun's notice. Hold on a moment, Shun realized. He did know of a way, didn't he? For some reason, the foreign man was made suddenly aware of hidden knowledge on breathing techniques, forms of meditation that could entirely block out moments of pain. It all flooded back to Shun in a confusing instant. That's right. There was a time when he knew and was capable of such feats, a time where he remembered a place he could go where pain was as substantial as thought, a powerful place in his mind where he was master and nothing was impossible. A place in his mind where he was master. That seemed so far-fetched. Shun's mind was not an ally, and had not been for many long years. His mind was a sepulcher, a fetid land. So how could a memory like that exist, if not to give false hope? Shun didn't give the idea as much thought as his finger continued to throb with a rhythmic pounding. Where was the harm in trying? If Shun could lessen the pain, then why not? Shun closed his eyes and tried to concentrate, tried to shut out the nagging pessimisms and malevolent cynicisms that lived in his mind as haunting specters. The lines of an old mantra returned through a misplaced memory. A golden lotus floats in infinite darkness. A single petal begins to open, shining bright, glorious light from its unfolding. Pain is an illusion. Pain is... No! A stab of pain from an ornery voice jolted Shun's eyes open. Shocks of energy clapped loudly in his mind and left as quickly as they had come. Eyes wide, Shun looked around, startled, trying to see who had just yelled at him, but there was nobody there. Nobody but the miserable Palaean sailor at the other end of the galley. Shun looked down at the throbbing finger. A minute had passed since he stabbed himself, and not even a shred of adrenaline had started to flow. It looks like Shun's body was also refusing to help. If Shun's mind was unwilling to relent comfort for his basic preservations, then it made sense his body wouldn't either. Again, Shun firmly grasped the hook and yanked the barb backwards through his body without hesitation. Skin torn, muscles ruptured, and the pain coursed like a fire in his hand. Shun shook his finger furiously, trying to wash away the pain in the motion, but gaining little more than an odd look from the fat sailor at the other end of the room. The rotund Palaean man had a dumb smile slapped across his face, amused by Shun's slip of the finger, amused by Shun's pain. The sailor was happy to feel superior to anyone for an instant in his pathetic life, and it was Shun who was the lesser man. Confidence had been a long dead friend, grave since overgrown with weeds in the sepulcher of Shun's mind, but that didn't mean he couldn't feel worse. Shun put the hook in its proper place and picked the eel back up, getting the procedure right and hanging the fish through the head. Shun was jealous of the fish, and in none of the best possible ways. As the foreign man reached for the next eel, he could feel an uneasy look coming from across the room. Shun looked to the fat Palaean sailor who had changed his expression from cruel humor to concern and wonder. Shun looked down to his finger. Ah, yes, that's right, he wasn't bleeding. He just pulled a hook out of his finger. Folk usually bleed from something like that, don't they? That's an unfortunate thing for this coworker to notice, and will surely be a rumor passed around the boat later. Shun didn't know much about his coworker, but he sure knew this particular sailor had a proclivity for gossip. A small saving grace, however, is that he was so much of a gossip that his word wouldn't be taken too seriously. At least that was the hope. Shun didn't mind this job, and he would like to continue working at it a little bit longer before being forced to leave because of the rumors that happened to find him as often as his misfortune does. Shun put the look of the Palayan sailor behind him as he squatted down and looped his forearms into the handles of buckets overflowing with eel chum. Shun stood with a small grunt of effort and walked out the door back onto the main deck, 2 full buckets per arm. The foreign man held out the chum in front of him, lean forearm muscles bulging and glistening in the midday sunlight. Carefully, Shun set the buckets down next to the port railing where men were setting up large, rusty iron cages. Slim, wired, and tight woven with rope netting, the cages were 10-span wide on all sides, hulking contraptions that hauled great loads of animal life from the sea bottom. Shun turned heel and went back to grab the bouquets of bait he had been working on. The fat Palayan sailor had picked up Shun's bait and was inspecting the hook he had impaled his finger on. Shun took the bait from his hands as well as the other flowing bunches near him. The foreign man quickly took the baited hooks back to the port railing where a man was already taking the buckets Shun had left and was chumming the water. Shun stepped over large brown leather buoys and, knowing his duty, walked into the first of the cages and began to hang the fresh-cut eels. Stepping over the large ropes coiled next to each cage, the barrel-chested first mate approached Shun outside the cage he was in.
"Shun,"
the first mate said in a low, bassy voice.
"A few of the cage tossers got themselves sick, betting each other they could eat raw ink sacs from a few of them large squid we caught, and suffice it to say, we're short a proper deck today."
Shun didn't look away from his work, but listened to the first mate all the same. The man was actually quite genial, and Shun almost liked him. Stepping out of the cage after hanging the bait, Shun inclined his head to look up at the first mate. "You want Shun help?" the foreign man asked, confused, wondering why anyone would want his assistance. Shun walked into the next cage, past the first mate, and began setting another bouquet of freshly gutted eel.
"I know strength when I see it,"
the large Palayan man said.
"I know if you were working the cages with me and another, we could get them done without a problem."
Shun thought about it as he exited the cage and picked up more bait to set inside the next. "First mate help also?"
"The captain wants this done right and quickly. And, well, to be honest, he wanted me to observe you. You're quite a hard worker, Shun. Maybe if you do well with the cages, then the captain might promote you to cage work."
Shun shook his head as he exited another cage and ducked into the last one. Shun is best alone. Shun does not like work with others.
"Well, that will be your choice to make, Shun. Without lies, I would like someone more reliable at the cages than the sons of Palayan mummers we have working now. Damnable fools, trying to sleep off squid ink like mountain-loving morons."
Shun looked pensive as he hung the last of the bait, giving the prospect more thought than anticipated. If Shun like after this one time, then Shun might agree.
"That's better than nothing,"
the first mate said with a barking laugh.
"I'll try and make it a good experience then."
Shun watched on as the tall Palayan first mate took the ends of the coiled ropes and began weaving complex knots onto the ringed latches. His expertise showed through with the ease of the exercise. Bulking muscle from the man flexed as he pulled on the ropes, cinching the binds tight. The first mate looked to Shun and urged him over with a flick of his head. Shun walked over and went to one side of the cage, taking a place opposite another ready sailor. The three shoved the unwieldy device to the railing. Lifting from the bottom, the men pushed it over and off the side of the ship. Quickly following after, the massive rope attached zipped over the railing with the cage, sending a reverberating note as it snaked over. At the end of the rope, 3 brown leather baubles filled with air went over, indicators for when the cage would be retrieved the next day.
"Ha!"
the first mate shouted.
"Now wasn't that easy?"
Sweat dripped from the large Palayan man's brow.
"I told you I knew you were strong, Shun. You're twice the muscle than most of these layabouts."
Shun snorted amusement, almost smirked. The compliment was the first he could remember. The easy way the first mate spoke to him felt welcoming, friendly, Though Shun knew it was a ruse to convince the foreign man that this work wasn't all bad, but Shun was still elated. The next cage went much the same, a pushing heave, a lifting of bulk, and a tossing of the cage. Shun could tell the repetition would cause a quick tire, but it wasn't too terrible. It wasn't really the loosing of the cages that was hard, it was the retrieving of full ones that was difficult. It was only necessary to have a few men for the tossing of a cage. It took 3 times as much to bring them back up.
Your size is deceitful, Shun, the first mate said.
He's like them drinks you throw, the other worker said to the strong Palayan man.
"Hi, he is,"
the first mate responded while realizing an epiphany.
"Small, but it will knock you on your ass if you aren't careful."
The 2 men laughed, and Shun felt a pressing in his chest that seemed like an urge to join. Shun stifled that want immediately. Such things had no place beside Shun anymore. The banter could have been mistaken for acceptance to anyone, a place of belonging, but Shun was too wise to believe in that kind of comfort. Shun didn't remember who, and he didn't remember when, but there were friends lost, loves lost, and family lost in too great of number to be coaxed into such foolish beliefs again. Friends pass. Love withers. Families separate. Any allure to think otherwise was a lie. Another cage toppled over the railing and started to plummet through the water. The 2 men had continued comparing Shun to strong drinks they had drowned at piers and docks near and far. 4 drinks, 2 fights, and 1 whore were used to describe the foreign man, and by the end of it, the smile Shun had pushed away was almost present. It had been far too long since he had felt involved with other people. He might have missed it if he wasn't so terrified of it.
"One more, lads,"
the first mate bellowed as he began to heave with the heavy bulk.
"Then we can go below deck and yell at the men who should have been doing this job in the first place."
Shun helped push the cage to the railing and felt a burn in his legs as he squatted down to grasp at the bottom and pushed up with an effort he hadn't used in a while. The cage went over and Shun turned to look at the first mate. The man had a warm smile, a smile reserved for genuine appreciation.
"Good work, Shun," he said. "Honestly, I don't think—"
Shun's legs were knocked from under him and his head whipped to the deck, cracking the wood below. Splinters pierced the right side of his skull. All breath had been knocked out of Shun's lungs, and before he could think of inhaling again, the foreign man found himself hurtling towards the starboard railing. There was a rope pulled tight around Shun's foot, and the grip was impossibly strong. The ankle of the foreign man snapped as it curved over the ship, and Shun's body whipped to follow. For a shattering second, Shun had grabbed at the wood railing with deft reflexes and held himself above the side of the ship long enough to see the panic on the faces of the crew. Wide-eyed shock. Shun's grip was torn from the weight of the sinking cage, rope slapping Shun's body to the water. The sea welcomed the foreign man like hard-packed dirt. Outside of mortal peril, the cool splash of the water would have been nice, enjoyable even. However, Shun was going to die. It was almost inevitable. Beneath the decks, Shun listened to stories passed between sailors in the crew quarters. Tales of horror about the dive, the drag of death to those unfortunate or stupid enough to get caught in the ropes of cages. So how did this all happen? Perhaps Shun's sun-soaked brain and tired body had worked against him, spinning his normally observant nature and perception of body. Or maybe it was that promise of friendship that was spoken softly like music that dropped Shun's guard. It was a terribly foolish thought and an even worse excuse. Shun could never have friends. Not again. His mind was a sepulcher after all, and each grave was a friend. Each grave was a greater part of himself that had died. Now Shun was going to die. Who would dig that grave? No one. Naught but the slow churning of cold waters and the swallowing darkness of their depths. Shun urged his torso down to grab at the rope. Hands grasped at a slipknot cutting into the skin around his ankle, but the rush of water was too strong and pushed Shun upright again, pushing him to attention, forcing the foreign man to witness his sinister descent. Shun looked up to the glass ceiling of the sea. The princess blade was growing smaller and dimmer. The sunlight was slowly being eaten, consumed whole by the abyss as the drag pulled harsh on his body. Panic began to grip at all angles of Shun's brain. His heavy, bulging eyes darted everywhere, and his hands struggled to find anything to cut the rope. But there was nothing. Nothing. Nothing at all. Shun let go of his muscles and allowed himself to be pulled mercilessly below. The sailors above couldn't stop what was already in motion, and neither could he. All the crew aboard the Princess Blade could look forward to was hoisting the odd foreign man's body up from the murky depths once the cage had hit the bottom and the baubles had raised back up to the surface. By then, Shun will have been long dead, and they all knew it. Shun knew it. He was a dead man anyway, so what else was new? Diaphragm spasms shocked Shun's chest. The need to inhale grew inside each and every thought. Chaotic synapses tried to override conscious thought. They yearned for breath and yelled at Shun with each minute abstaining. The call would not be yielded, though. Giving in was easy and a familiar feeling to Shun, but something within him denied access to do so, stubbornly holding on to a small flicker of hope. There is a chance. That optimism within Shun spoke. Dig deep. Remember. Shun didn't understand the voice. The cadence and timbre was a language long forgotten, long buried in a sepulchre no one had walked. It spoke again. Deeper. Remember. Shun felt the ghost of a memory let a tendril raise and be known, and he grasped for it, more curious than eager. Good, the optimism said. That's right. Shun remembered. Monk Jian could hold his breath for 20 minutes. Longer, actually. His personal record matched how long his pet striped eel could regularly manage, but yet again, it was common for disciples of Dragony to have that kind of control over mind, will, and body. All one had to do was clear the brain of thought and steady heart and lung. How did the mantra go again? A golden lotus floats in infinite darkness. A single petal begins to open, shining bright, glorious light from its unfolding. Calm is stillness within stillness. My energy... Stop! A stab of pain jolted Shun's eyes open. Shocks of energy clapped loudly in his mind and then left as quickly as they had come. Another voice had kicked Shun out again. That was almost predictable. There was a thread of hope, and it was quickly cut before Shun could find solace in it. Shun could not overcome the chaos around him, and he could not overcome the chaos inside him. There was a wall within the drowning man that stopped him, and there was a wall of water tearing at his clothes and his skin. There could be no hope, but Shun accepted that before this drag, countless years since past. Shun took in the deep, dark nothing, the red in his eyes, unable to manage the pitch of the sea bottom. They bulged from his head and pounded with pressure and pain, swelling with warm tears that burned with the salt. Each drop passed upward and mixed with the cool of the dark. His chest was an aching cavity. The roar of the water deafeningly rushed past his ears like crashing river rapids. Sheer will had been keeping Shun alive this long, stitches of his self-preservation holding at the tapestry of his life with frayed edges. But no matter how long Shun had trained and honed mental acuity to take control of his body, it gave way to basic animal impulse. With a deep inhale, Shun's lungs surged with water. Agony racked his throat. His neck bloated with the rush of liquid. The tissues gorged and burned. Shun's throat was pinpricked by pain from tooth to lung. Shun heaves that vainly tried to squeeze out the seawater. each spasm stabbing daggers into his middle. Pain spiked and fell and spiked again. Between each hefty heave of his diaphragm, Shun made the motion of screams, snuffed mutely. Fingers clawing at his own body, desperately trying to overcome the pain, overcome death, pulling on the rope on his broken ankle. This was it. The edges of his vision began to dim, close in and narrow to a small circle of dark surrounded by a deeper dark. Death beckoned. The cage made purchase with the sea floor. Sediment kicked up all around the rope wire and the iron weights. Baited eels danced, lost to the darkness. The silent impact would have looked eerie in the pitch night of the bottom had there been anyone to witness. The tightly wound rope began to grow partially taut as the brown leather baubles raced back upwards, no longer bound by the whim of the heavy cage. Shun floated 10 span above the bait he had been cutting minutes before, leg tethered and shattered. Gray linen clothes drifted off his skin and floated to and fro. A crushing pressure gently swayed his body. Shun was dead. Dead as the darkness. Again. Shun opened his eyes. A pitch black encompassed his sight. Shun was not alive, not really, and he knew he wouldn't actually die. The thought alone made all the panic and the fighting against the draw of death feel silly to him, but it was hard to argue to a mind it wasn't going to die when the evidence in front of it was so convincing. Shun wanted to die. Oh, he sorely wanted to die, but he couldn't. Well, he hadn't anyway. Not yet. A small consolation was the lack of pain and sensation. There was no inherent need to breathe once he reached this point. Sure, Shun felt pressure on his body, but he did not suffer. Shun could feel the water within him, bulging his chest in full inhale. But it only felt like he had just eaten a big meal. He jerked his head from side to side, twisting to look over his surroundings, but there was nothing to see. Shun's movements were awkward beneath the water. He had no solid anchor to hold onto, and his motions were clumsy. The panic from before had all but faded, but it was slowly being replaced. An anxiety started to fret its way up the strings of his emotions. Shun looked around him expectantly. She's late, Shun thought. She may not come at all, actually. How long had it been since I last died? Surely enough time has elapsed. Shun could feel the slow rise of nervousness burn in his stomach. The anxiety did not orbit fear, as it had been minutes ago, but it did circle anticipation. Circled like a hawk above prey. Shun just wasn't sure which he was, though, the raptor or the feast. The foreign man began to brush off his clothing, but was having a hard time of it as it floated away from his batting hand. Shun took the ends of his shirt and stuffed them into his trousers, tucking neatly before he undid the cloth sash around his middle and tied it nicely again. Shun smoothed his bald head and wiped his face clean of any sediment that had been kicked up from the cage. Shun's heart didn't beat. He held his hand up to his chest and felt only the cloth beneath. Heavy eyes flitted in the darkness, surveying the deep and foreboding blank environment, but the abyss gave up nothing that he wanted. Worry began to cross where the anxiety circled. Whenever Shun knew he was going to die, he countered the pain with the chance he would get to see her, the origin of his new manic fluster. His desperation might be too much. It looked like she wasn't coming. Thudump! Shun's heart. It beat. The sound rich in his ears like a drum being pounded. Shun looked up from the bottom of the jet sea where the gaze had begun to linger, and he started to look over his shoulders again. When his search came up back in front of him, Shun caught the faint glow of a small gray orb far in the distance. Thudump! The orb grew in sizes threefold. Shun knew it didn't actually grow in size. It was just merely getting closer very quickly with each infrequent slam of Shun's beating heart. But at this distance, it looked like an optical illusion. The travel the orb made was unnatural. Light began to penetrate through the water, and Shun could see the edges of his clothes, which he used to better smooth his shirt. The dump. Jumping ahead of itself, the gray orb started to take shape as it parsed the black of the sea. The distinct form of a body glowing dully in the water came alive to the eye, arms stretched out like she was falling down to meet him, hair and dress flowing behind her as if she was caught in the wind, caught in the same sinister descent Shun had found himself in, but she was far more graceful about it. Shun could feel that anxiety twist his stomach. The dump. And there she was, not but a leap in front of him. The frayed white lace of her dress lapped ahead of her and stopped a thumb's breadth from touching Shun. The intricately layered dress danced around her in the flowing bop of the water. There was a thick white belt that went around and tied with a large ornate knot on her back. The hands were resting gently on top of it, her skin like porcelain. Thin wrists and fingers poised tools of seduction. They alone were enough to take the breath of any person regardless of how much water filled their lungs. Tassels of decorated braided silk hung from her shoulders, and they had followed the lace of her dress to meet near Shun's face, ends of the fabric snapping out like the heads of pale vipers. Shun wanted to look up. He wanted to look at her face, but that nervousness was so strong that he didn't think himself capable. It was always like this. The mix of feelings he felt for her were guarded in some mystery that didn't relent to him. They swirled within Shun like a noxious mixture that churned his stomach. He longed for her, but he feared her. He loved her, but he loathed her. Shun was happy to see her, but felt overwhelming sadness when he did. One of those porcelain hands reached up to his chin while he was lost in his thoughts. Her touch was warm and precise, hands that had been near a fire, hands deft at touch and focus. She lifted Shun's head up to meet hers. Gods above and below, she was beautiful. A thin neck ran up to a slight point of her chin where her jaw curved back to her ears, smooth as a carved statue artists lust to create. Her sharp features were shaped perfectly to Shun's eyes. He could find no flaw and never had before. Any time he had ever looked upon her, he found himself astounded. Pale cheeks rose up to meet her eyes that were kissed in milky white. The lashes she looked past were a stark bone, and they batted at his attention. Her stare was intermittently interrupted between waves of her hair that passed in front of her gaze. They were strands of radiant locks that surrounded her head like the tentacles of a leviathan. She smiled at Shun, and he realized he must look like the daft boy entranced by the painted lord's daughter. Shun tried to smile back, but it hurt. It hurt because she was everything he ever wanted, everything he wished to hold. Shun's lower lip quivered with distress as he thought about how he could not hold her, how he had not yet. Her smile was swords to look at. It cut at the foreign man, but he could not look away now that he had started adoring her. That smile hurt more than death, more than dying, more than the rush of water into lungs and the struggle to survive in a world wholly against you. Nothing hurt more than that smile, and Shun limply hung in the water with a lip that wouldn't stop shaking. A sore ball of regret and sadness started to build in his throat. His eyes began burning with their own water again. Shun shyly looked away, but the pale woman moved delicately to stay with his eyes. She looked confused, as though trying to look away from her was folly, like no one had ever done so before. It was cruel because Shun could not continue to bear her beauty without crumbling, but at the same time, it was all he wanted to do. It seems as though she didn't give Shun an option as those large eyes softly looked over him. Gods, How long had it been since he had seen her last? Sean tried to look elsewhere again, but there was only darkness, and the light led right back to her. At this moment, she was the sun, and Sean bathed in that radiance. The only negative emotion he ever felt around her was an unknown pain in his heart, but considering how Sean always felt when she wasn't around, it was more than worth it. Sean would trade that wandering loss over his crippling depression any day. Suddenly, Sean began to weep. An instant onslaught of tears poured. He was unable to stop it from coming and unable to rightly understand why he did either. He wept with shaking shoulders and a quake in his chest, a heaving, ugly cry. The shy smile he had almost worn broke without warning, and a frown had doubled over his expressions. A sob born of sorrow battled at his mind, which futilely tried to stop it with each passing moment. Sean dropped his head again and squeezed his eyes shut, teeth grating with a grimace, unable to control the motion, mourning furiously. The pale woman reached out to his chin and lifted his head to hers once more. Her eyes were burdened with a sadness that Sean felt he did not deserve. Her own frown sent a pang of pain through him again, the pooling of his tears shifting with the salt of the water. Sean was lost, upsettingly happy in a pinprick of time. He knew that this is where his heart lay eternal with her. Sean knew it. He just wished he didn't look so profoundly foolish in front of her whenever he got the chance to be near. Sean mouthed a word in the passing pitch of the sea, mouthed a word he could not physically speak. Please. The pale woman sighed with the heavy weight of the question. She looked down briefly before returning with lips stretching thin over her face. Her head slowly shook left and right. The motion made her hair shimmer in a glowing walk, her eyes filled with an overloaded pity. Sean held his gutted disappointment at bay, held the grief, the anguish, the heartache at bay, but not without the frown. Not with his eyes red with the pain of crying, muscles tense and holding firm in a tight grip. Sean's lips moved again, mouthing his distress, asking another question he had always wanted to speak. Why? The tip of the question was met with the abrupt tightening of the rope around Sean's ankle. A jolt of movement pulled Sean upward and a few feet away from the beautiful pale woman. The only essence Sean wanted, and the only essence that could never acquiesce to him. That had never acquiesced to him. Not yet. Sean held out an arm down to her glowing form, lighting the cage as it started to return to the surface. Sean was hanging upside down as the rope was lifting him upwards. His fingers were stretched outward as though with a little more effort he could touch her, grab her, hold her. She looked up to him and held out her own arms instinctually before dropping him to her side, eyes still filled with that pity, lips still tight in that frown. Sean eagerly looked to her fading glow and never looked away, never let his eyes wander, still stuck to the darkness that had swallowed his hope, his love. He despaired even as the water tumbled him side to side with the motion of being brought back to the orange sunshine of the glass sea ceiling. The crooning of the sea's waves met the frantic pulling and disruption of the rope, clashing as the two energies met each other. Sean, the rope, and the cage were battered as they crossed the portal from sea to air, none of which mattered as Sean crested the surface. His limp body banged against the hull of the Princess Blade as the crew pulled him up. Pain was still unfelt. Sean was still halfway past the throes of death.
"Careful, you blasted mountain-loving ninnies!"
The first mate barked at the men hauling up the rope. Hands grasped at Sean's clothes and body and they pulled him on board, untangling his foot from the grasp of the thick rope. They set the foreman down on his back where the deck felt warm against his soaked body. The wood had been baking in the sun and it added a strange comfort. Shun looked up to the sky, staring past the rigging and the sails. Dismay, the grim expression of his last moments. The first mate paced near to his body before kneeling down to Shun, head on his chest, listening for a heart.
"I thought you were ready, boy,"
he said as he listened forlorn, one ear on the wet shirt.
"Ready to shed your green and become a sailor. But Shallan, the eternal tide, is a cruel mistress of waves sometimes."
"May her body ever find the shore," a chorus of forlorn sailors said at the mention of their goddess. The first mate raised his hand and put his fingers on Shun's eyelids, closing them with little effort. Shun thought it was sweet that he had bothered to check to see if he had somehow survived the harrowing journey, but Shun hadn't. He died down there. The first mate showed a kindness Shun, yet again, did not deserve. Shun did not deserve the pale woman and her beauty. He deserved to be alone with the sepulchre in his mind. Opening his eyes, Shun looked up and focused on the first mate as his body heaved vainly at the water deep in his throat and lungs. The burly sailor fell backwards onto his elbows. Shocked and disturbed, he grasped a large breath into his wide chest at the sight. Shun pushed himself onto his feet, vaguely noticing every sailor nearby running away, scrambling up and down stairs, climbing into rigging and getting to the opposite side of the ship from him. They darted in all directions at once. Shun lumbered to the railing of the Princess Blade and casually leaned forward, toppling down upon the hard wood. Shun missed the solar plexus and heard ribs snap in the process. The pain still didn't register. Getting back to his feet, Shun stumbled a few feet back and faced the railing again. He leaned forward and slammed his chest on the side of the ship. This time finding success, Shun's diaphragm spasmed and pushed a gout of water from his mouth. This particular trick was a hard lesson learned many years ago from one of the other times he had drowned, much faster than waiting for the water to leave his body over the travel of half a dagger. Shun collapsed to the wood in front of the railing and gurgled a partial inhale of water before he retched more out of his lungs with a violent heave from his chest. The diaphragm evacuated a good portion of the water this time. Shun sharply inhaled again with less bubbles and began to vomit seawater and his meager sailing rations. Each cough and burping heave sent all the water out and brought flush back to Shun's skin. Shun hadn't noticed at the time, but he had grown pale, lips probably a sickly blue, but he could feel color returning to them, a warmth returning. His heartbeat did not return, but that was normal. However, the pain did return. All of the pain that had been pushed away during death returned all at once, and it sent Shun into painful convulsions. Shun gritted his teeth as he pushed himself up against the railing, sitting with clenched fists on the wood. "Well, I'm going to have to leave this ship," Shun thought to himself as he tried to ignore the stabs of pain over his body. "I will have to travel somewhere else again, far enough away that this story doesn't reach people who will know me. Something more inland, perhaps. Somewhere there wasn't an overabundance of water." The first mate had gotten to his feet at some point and was bent low in a stance built for fighting or fleeing at a moment's notice. Taking slow and brave steps, the first mate approached the once drowned man as the pain had begun to subside. Shun's face and expression returned to a placid pool of unfeeling before looking up, disappointed, grim, and hollow.
What?
The burly first mate stuttered.
"What are you?"
Shun sighed. "Alive." Thank you for listening to me recite Chapter 2 of my book. I'm so pleased with it, and I'm pleased with you guys. Everyone who's listening just fills me with so much joy, and I would be remiss if I did not bring up my other wonderful sponsors for today, the lovely people over at Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rory's Brainworks, just like this YouTube channel. They are my story vanguard, my colonizers of dreams. Without them, these book endeavors would be way harder to accomplish. Thank you for spending your time with me. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to this madness, and comment down below how you felt about this chapter of my book and the other chapters I had done previously. As always, I'm Rory. This is my brain. I'm fairly certain it works. Be safe and go create some art.